How's everybody doing today? We are starting a new series. We're going to call this one Producer Table Talks. The inspiration behind this one is, we do those shorter producer tip videos. They're only 1 minute long, and we've had folks come to us and say, we really like those, but maybe could you expand a little bit on some of those topics? So we thought that was a really good idea. And so we want to get questions from everybody, but also we thought it'd be great to go back and expand a little bit on some of those earlier topics that we covered in the producer tips. Joined here today by Jackson Malden, my son, studio assistant, and bass player extraordinaire. Jackson, how you doing?
Doing good. How's it going?
What are we talking about today, Jackson?
Yeah, so I thought we'd just start with our first producer tip video,
Okay.
get a little more in depth on that. In that video, we talked about drum samples,
Yeah.
some non-traditional ways that you've used drum samples in the past. And
Yeah.
so let's just dig into drum samples. It's a hot topic. Some people like to not use them. Some people just use samples about.
Right.
So let's just hear some of the traditional and non-traditional ways you use it, just kind of your thought process when it comes to drum
Great,
samples.
that's great. Yeah, so I use it in a couple of ways. The first way is the way that most everybody uses them to enhance. For me, it would just be kick drum and snare. I never use samples on toms. I don't know why it worked out that way along the many years I've been doing this, but I just don't use them on toms. Toms just never seem to require it if they're recorded properly. And honestly, I spent almost all of my recording career, producing career, not using samples on kick and snare. And then after a while, it got to be, let's just say this. I'm glad I did that because it really forced me to learn the fundamentals of drum recording, to figure out how to get really good punchy drum sounds without any sort of aid from samples or anything like that. And part of it was, in the beginning, sample technology was a little bit more archaic and it was harder to incorporate. Later on,
You've been doing this for a minute.
I've been doing this for a couple of minutes. Then it got a little easier, and I still kind of held out. Then I started realizing I was just being a little stubborn, that these are tools that we can use. The concern is that they would be overused. And even to this day, I still notice recordings, you hear them and you're like, this is not a heavy metal record, and yet the drums sound like samples.
Right.
And no matter how good the samples are, if a producer leans too heavily on samples, it just sounds like a drum machine. It just doesn't sound like a real rootsy, organic sounding record. And I never wanted to do that,
And to this day, you still do have a very organic drum sound and feature a lot of the real in-the-room drums along with your samples. The samples are really more just to enhance them, I'd say.
Yeah, that's right. Some people will go so far as to replace the mic'd drums with samples. Now that's a real faux pas in my book. But even if they don't do that, sometimes they just rely on them too much, and really mostly what you hear are the samples. So yeah, for me, samples are more, just like you say, a subtle enhancement. They're almost kind of like thinking about parallel compression, where maybe the sample is less dynamic, and so it's a little bit more consistent stroke, say on a snare drum or a kick drum. You just ride that in under a little bit underneath, and it just sort of tightens it up a little bit, while you still hear like a well-recorded drum is the main thing that you hear. So that's the more traditional use of it.
Right.
I just wanted to talk about how I kind of tried to avoid some of the, let's say, the pitfalls in using samples in a traditional way. But go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, from there, let's get more into some of the non-traditional ways and some of the little tips and tricks you figured out along the way that you can use samples.
Yeah, so this is maybe where it gets a little more interesting, and it really kind of more what we talked about on that first video.
Right.
Was this sort of non-traditional use, but man, it is a good hack. And you've had to learn this very well because you've taken over the editing process when we do tracking and stuff, and so you're the one having to plug in all this stuff and get it set up, and so you're very familiar. I'm not telling you anything because
I've spent some time there the past few months.
That's right. You really know what we're talking about there. But for folks out here, what we do is we go ahead and we get a sample kick and a sample snare. And instead of some people will just sort of copy the kick and the snare and then put a trigger software on it or something like that, or Drumagog or whatever they use, and just leave it running live. But we actually go an extra step and we actually record those samples as audio onto another track. So
you don't like to keep it simple.
I don't like that. No. I like to turn everything into audio as quickly as I can. Like when people bring keyboards in, or if I'm doing keyboards and it's MIDI, as soon as we get it the way we want it, that thing turns into audio. But so the same is true for these samples. And so now we have, say, a mic'd. Let's just use snare drum for example. We have a mic'd snare drum, and we have a track that has the sample snare drum printed as audio. Okay?
Right.
And so that's there to be used in the subtle enhancement way that we spoke about. But in addition, what we do is we copy it one more time onto another track and label it like snare gate.
Yeah.
Right? And so what we do then is take a bus and you send it over to the mic'd snare and you put a gate on the mic snare, and instead of having a frequency or just the velocity of the snare open and close the gate, you just have it feed from that, you know, a side chain if you will, but you just feed it from the bus of that sample gate. So there's no bleed on the sample, right?
Right. It immediately cuts out all the grabbing from the toms, grabbing from the kick, all
That's
that
right.
stuff.
No cymbals, nothing to confuse the gate.
Right.
So it's a very clean way to open and close a gate.
Yeah.
And then another little trick that we do is, you know, if you're not getting quite the initial, you know, transient of the snare, is just go in, and we do this, just scooch it forward a few milliseconds.
Right.
The sample. And it works great.
Yeah.
It's a super easy solution. It's a really clean way to open and close a gate. And there's another thing that we do with these samples as well, which is kind of non-traditional. Instead of using a gate, we'll have that sample sort of feed a compressor.
Right.
So
yeah.
what, you know, quizzing Jackson here. what is a application where we would have it feed a compressor rather than a gate?
Right. We've used that whenever we're doing like a train beat, like in a country song. That's come up quite a few times actually.
Yeah. We do a lot of those here. You know,
yeah, here in Texas.
Being in Texas.
A lot of train beats.
Yeah, but a train beat is that, you know, where you have the subdivisions on the snare instead of the hi-hat or something like that.
Right.
So that's fine, and that sounds great. You've got usually a louder backbeat, but then those quieter subdivisions are in between on that snare. So the problem is that, you know, you know, it sounds great and everything, but when you get the whole track in there, all the guitars and all the wild stuff, you know, the track will just drink up those subdivisions, and all you really hear is the backbeat.
Right.
And so what do you do about that? You can't just turn it up because then the backbeat's too loud, you know.
Yeah.
So what we do is we take that mic'd snare track and we copy it, put it on its own track, and then we take that sample track, which again doesn't have all the subdivisions, it's just the backbeat.
Right.
We take that same bus that we would have sent it to the gate, you know, for the other stuff, but this time we send it over to that copied mic snare and we put a compressor on it that'll take a key from some other source. In this case, it'll be that sample snare track. And we set the attack quick, we set the release quick, set the threshold to stun.
Yeah,
because all it's going to do is it's going to hit that compressor only when the backbeats of the snare hit, so it's going to pull that snare down.
Right.
It'll recover really fast because you have your release set fast, and what you have then is you have a track where you hear the subdivisions more, and you can sort of roll it in next to the other one, the original one, and you're essentially just turning up the subdivisions.
So now you kind of have volume control over the backbeat alone through the sample, and through the subdivisions alone through the compressed track. It kind of gives you just a little more control over the sound.
It's a really cool way to do it. I mean, you know, if it's a really subtle and sparse song, you know, you probably don't need to do it. Yeah. But sometimes, you know, a song with a train beat in it is really loud and kind of rambunctious, has a lot of tracks on it.
Right.
And in that case, you know, you kind of are left with that problem. This is a solution for that, using samples.
There we go.
And anyway, I hope this helps. This kind of stuff is interesting to me, and it seems to be interesting to a lot of folks out there because they keep, you know, we're hearing from them and stuff like that. So we want to do more of these.
Yeah, for sure. You know, we can keep doing them based on these producer tips that we've done in the past. But what we'd really like to do is hear from y'all what y'all are interested in learning about, and we can give you our 2 cents. Go ahead and leave comments if you have any questions about the producing, mixing, mastering world.
Yeah.
And we don't know everything, but we can give you our 2 cents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See you next time.
We'll see you next time.